Okay, good evening. I'm David Levine. My guest tonight is Ed Silverman. Ed is a senior writer and Pharmalot columnist at Stat. He has covered the pharmaceutical industry for the past 20 years. He previously worked at the Wall Street Journal, the Star Ledger of New Jersey, Newsday, and Investors Business Daily. In 2018, he started his Pharmalot View columns, along with several other former Wall Street Journal colleagues. He was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in explanatory journalism for a series of stories on prescription pricing. I just want a little housekeeping. If you have a question for Ed, please put it in the Q&A box, not the chat box, and we will get to your questions. So Ed, I want to say thank you for joining us. So one of the top stories in the evening news tonight was about the Kaiser Foundation poll that says most Americans are worried political pressure will lead to premature approval of COVID-19 vaccine. Half say they would not get a free vaccine approved before Election Day. And Democratic voters prioritize coronavirus in presidential voting decision. Republicans prioritize the economy. Most do not expect a vaccine before the November election. Just 4 in 10 will get a vaccine. It was available before then. So when do you think we'll have a vaccine based on all this, based on what you know? And what do you think of people saying that they don't think it's going to happen, we're not going to take it?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. It's possible, based on what we've heard from the Pfizer CEO, that we could have something in a matter of weeks. But for the purposes of your question, I'll say I'm from Missouri and say, show me. I want to believe, I'm sure like a lot of people, maybe not everyone, but I would like to see a vaccine, a good one, as soon as possible. But this is a very laborious process. I'm not a scientist. I've never worked on vaccine development, but covering pharma, it's actually now 25 years that I've covered pharma. And covering it this long, one of the things I've learned is that it does take a long time to get these things right. And as we saw with the AstraZeneca situation, halting the trial, however briefly that may occur or may not occur, this is a situation that's fraught with risk. So conservatively, I'm hedging here, I'm taking the long way around, but conservatively, if Pfizer doesn't meet that timeline that CEO talked about, we could be looking not just weeks, but months, but I'd like to be pleasantly surprised.
So the AstraZeneca CEO was on TV this morning, and he was saying that this is a very common thing to halt a trial with vaccines, and that people should not be surprised by this. And he said it's just that there's so much scrutiny on the vaccine process. Do you agree with him?
Do I agree that it's not unusual that there could be a halt to a clinical trial? I wouldn't say that it doesn't happen. There are all sorts of reasons that trials get stopped momentarily. Momentarily probably isn't the right word. For a period of time, brief period, sometimes longer than other times, obviously. But I think he's missing the point. I think there are a lot of people who understand that, as I said a moment ago, vaccine development is risky. He's been, and yes, there's a microscope on his company and others, but there's been a lot of scrutiny of AstraZeneca the last couple of days for other reasons beyond simply that they halted the vaccine. But that aside, these things happen. Trials get halted. There's an issue with how data is gathered. There's an issue with a manufacturing procedure. Lots of different reasons. So, generally speaking, he's not off point, but there, as I started to say, there are other issues here too.
And also, what do you make of the, I never seen this before, that all the pharmaceutical companies, there are 9 of them got together and made a public pledge not to seek government approval without extensive safety and effectiveness data. Do you see that cooperation very often in drug companies?
No, and I'm happy to talk more about the AstraZeneca issues, but regarding the public pledge, there are 2 things actually that happened last week in regard to your question. One was the CEOs of the companies who are on the board of the Bio Trade Group had issued an open letter saying that the vaccines and COVID therapies as well should be approved or authorized only based on rigorously scientific process. There should be established, the established standards for ensuring safety and effectiveness. And essentially, the letter you're referring to was billed as a public pledge by 9 different companies, several of them the world's largest pharmaceutical companies that are working on COVID vaccines, and a few smaller vaccine companies such as Novavax and Moderna. And they essentially reiterated some of the language that you saw in the bio letter. The bio letter was a little bit more pointed in addressing some of the controversy surrounding the FDA and Trump. The bio letter talked about the FDA's historic independence and that decisions should be made free from politics. That's a direct reference to weeks and almost months now of controversy surrounding the FDA and the concerns that Trump is trying to push through anything that would, one, create a good headline for his profile, because the administration's taking such a beating for the way it's handled the vaccine up to this point. So he's trying to change the messaging and he pushed the idea that hydroxychloroquine could be useful. And there's still debate about that, although increasingly there are studies questioning its use for the virus. But in any event, the FDA issued an emergency use authorization and later revoked it. And then much more recently, there was an emergency use authorization for convalescent blood plasma, which the administration touted as a medical breakthrough, but it's been around forever. And it's not clear that it's to the extent to which it can truly be useful, at least on a widespread basis yet. So, and I don't want to go off on a tangent, but when that announcement was made, the FDA commissioner either stumbled over his language or somehow he conveyed the wrong data about a study indicating that the plasma could be useful for this situation, and it created the impression, an overall impression, that the FDA commissioner is under Trump's thumb. He's not independent enough. The agency's being pushed around and bullied, and it's creating distrust across the country. And as a result, that's not helpful really to anybody who wants to see an effective medicine or vaccine. And for all the FDA's faults, it's still considered a gold standard. It's sort of a cliche now, but that's like an insurance policy of sorts for all the pharmaceutical companies, because regardless of the attributes of your product, maybe it's approved by the FDA with a warning label. It's still, if it's still approved as safe and effective, that's something you can take to the bank. And so it's not good business for any of those companies to see the FDA and its historic, the historic view of its independence and the understanding that it makes decisions largely free of politics. That's not good business for this industry. So they're trying to get out in front of the curve and take advantage of the fact for the last few months, after years of being beat up over their pricing, that now they're being seen as saviors almost, or potential saviors, and get in front of the criticism that is leveled at FDA and try to tell the public and try to tell the administration that there's only one way to do this, because if you hit the fast forward button, anything that weakens the FDA now is not good for the way they have to do business, as I said a moment ago. And this, in a way, this feeds into the whole hoopla over AstraZeneca, because the AstraZeneca CEO, Pascal Soriot, is trying to explain, okay, this is not an unusual event. It's routine. The problem that, and I'm not sure how many of the viewers know this, but Tuesday night, Stat News broke the story that the trial was on hold and there was one patient with a serious adverse event. And the company did not issue any statement. They did respond to reporters, but they did not provide really any detail to clarify the situation. And it wasn't until the following morning, Wednesday morning, yesterday morning, there was a statement put out, but it didn't really add any specifics. Meanwhile, around the same time yesterday morning, the company issued the statement. The CEO, Pascal Soriot, was on a conference call hosted by JP Morgan for its clients, and he added a little more detail. And it raised some issues because, first of all, it's ironic. You know, his company is one of the companies signing the public pledge I described. And while that public pledge never used the word transparent in any form, clearly it was an appeal to a higher moral ground, even though, as I said, the pledge is partly about what's good for business. So yesterday, the appearance is that instead of disclosing that all that information publicly to help ensure that there's confidence in the vaccine makers, in the process involving vaccine development and vaccine approval, what does AstraZeneca do? They hold back. They don't share enough of the information. And there are different reasons that's a problem. In no particular order, other investigators, researchers at other companies want to know, hey, what's gone wrong? What is it with this one patient? What kind of clues do we need to look for in the kind of vaccine technology we may be using or might be using? That's one way of looking at it. What does it say about the ability to persuade other people to enroll in clinical trials if they can't properly characterize what's happening with this trial? And by the way, this is actually the second time in the last several weeks where the company had paused this particular trial because a patient had apparently developed a similar side effect, although it turned out, the company says, to be unrelated to the vaccine. But they didn't disclose that. So suddenly, twice in several weeks, there's a hold, and no one knows anything. And then there's another issue, which is just, and this is where this gets off into legal questions, but companies, if you recall, will often say they will disclose information, certain information, because they have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. There's something called Regulation FD. They have to disclose what's known as material information, something material to the operations of the business. Fine, if you're a shareholder, whether you own 1 share or 1 million shares, that's your right to know about that, and you should know about that. So that's ostensibly the approach the company took yesterday on the call with JP Morgan and its clients. But a couple of things. A small thing, if you're not a JP Morgan client, but you're an investor, you were left out in the cold. You didn't know additional information. Was it material? We could debate about that. But given the scrutiny, as the AstraZeneca CEO acknowledged, about being under a microscope, any little detail can affect the stock. And the stock dropped, by the way, on the news that the trial was halted. So if you're frozen out of that meeting and you're an investor, you might be ticked off. You would say, hey, if you're going to have that kind of call, put out a press release so at least we know what you're talking about and we can all assess the information. But stepping back again to the larger picture, it gives the impression that AstraZeneca doesn't care enough about the implications, as I explained, for the clinical trial hold and what it means for different folks, trial participants, investigators, the public's trust of the vaccine development and approval process. Instead, he conducted it like business as usual, shareholders first, whatever is going to drive up the stock price first. That was the wrong approach.
Okay. So you've been covering the pandemic since March. What are some of the stories that you've been covering, and what's changed since since we went on lockdown March 16th?
Well, we have a team at STAT and we pick off different pieces of this, and sometimes we work together and overlap. And you can imagine there are a lot of different angles and directions in trying to cover this kind of story. It truly is a global story that goes everywhere at once. And we have people who specialize in covering infectious disease, picking through clinical trial results, understanding company strategy. We have folks in Washington trying to keep ahead of what's going on with the politics, obviously, but also the health policy. All of that's obviously intertwined. I've gotten involved in some of those stories here and there. A couple of things I've spent a lot of my time myself in contributing to the coverage has to do with what I think of as the supply chain. Early on, I wrote about how what was happening in China, where the virus first popped up, would mean for availability of active pharmaceutical ingredients, given that China and India are essentially the dominant suppliers around the world, what that would mean for the ability of drug companies that we know in this part of the world and Europe and elsewhere, they're still dominant. They still hold big market share with big selling products, but where are their ingredients coming from and how much of a problem will this cause? So that was back in March, an attempt to look ahead to the extent to which that would be a problem or could be a problem. More recently, over the past 3 weeks, I'd spent time looking at the supply chain, literally the link between the time a vaccine in particular would leave the manufacturer's plant and end up in your arm. All the different links. And it's complicated, and there's a lot of issues there because it's not the sort of thing that the average person, including me for that matter, would spend a lot of time thinking about under normal circumstances. And to some extent, it's the same supply chain. The problem is that everything is accelerating now. The timelines are getting compressed because we want one or more vaccines as soon as possible. We're going to need hundreds of millions, billions of doses. Some vaccines will require 2 doses. There are all these issues that will put pressure on the supply chain. These issues, and stop me or quiz me as I continue here, these issues include making sure that the vaccines are stored at the right temperature. And some of them have to be stored. Typically, vaccines are stored at -2 to -8 Celsius. And with the COVID vaccine, some have to be stored at -20 Celsius, -70 Celsius. So you've got new challenges. You've got to make sure that you have the right boxes for vaccines that are then placed in temperature controlled containers. You have to have enough of the boxes, enough of the containers. They've got to be transported in trucks, and you got to make sure that they don't get lost or stuck in traffic if possible. Then they've got to be placed at facilities at airports that have enough of the refrigerated storage space. And then you've got to make sure they're not on the tarmac too long. And the key reason is there's stability issues. How long is any given vaccine effective if it encounters something other than that mandated temperature that for which it's being stored? So there's that. Because of the pandemic, there are fewer flights. Now you would think, oh, what does that matter? Okay, United canceled 80% of its flights to California. I'm making this up. So what? What does that got to do with vaccines? Well, as it turns out, approximately half of pharmaceuticals are shipped in the bellies of passenger planes. So if there are fewer planes flying people around, that means there's fewer opportunities to fly the vaccines around. So how do you compensate for that? So they've got the air cargo companies and the pharma companies have to work together to figure out, do they repurpose certain portions of planes, do they hire planes, all these things. And then you've got to hit the button, the reverse button, because when it lands, then you've got to make sure that the vaccines remain cold and they can get to the proper place at the proper time. And in poor countries, you have infrastructure that might make it more difficult. Are there enough trucks? Are there enough storage facilities? You want to get to rural areas. How's that going to work? Maybe the roads aren't always very sufficient. I mean, you know, not every country has an interstate highway system that takes you most places. And then there's another piece, which is, you know, essentially, how do you avoid having this turned into an episode of The Sopranos? Because this is going to be the world's most valuable commodity for an extended period of time. And so companies are trying to figure out how to make sure that there are always heists, and it's not new that pharmaceuticals have been, you know, targeted for heists, but this is going to be almost like, you know, a bad movie if something goes awry. So Pfizer, for instance, is putting GPS tracking on every box in the truck, or instead of just one GPS device in a truck. So not only can they track if a truck gets stuck in traffic, or if it goes off the route, or if the driver stops longer than they would expect at a rest stop, you know, they can also figure out if something is looking funny because it suddenly, you know, the signal from the GPS says it stopped somewhere when it's not supposed to, or whatever. You can use your imagination. All these things are being planned out right now. And the big concern is just not enough of everything that's needed to prevent bottlenecks.
The other thing I've read about is that there aren't enough syringes for everybody.
Yes, so I was describing the chain from the time the vaccine leaves the plant. You're getting into that other part of it. And yeah, there's a problem with syringes and vials. And it's I think there's a deal with Corning up in upstate New York to try to alleviate some of this problem. But yeah, that's another issue. None of this is easy. It's almost like a war effort, unfortunately.
Should the military be involved in the logistics? Because they're very good at this.
They probably should be. One of the things I've been working on is trying to get more detail about the extent to which they would get involved. But as you can imagine, they're trying to not discuss that. But yes, there's at some point, I mean, you do have a general. One of the three people running Operation Warp Speed is a general, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah. He's talks very plainly. I kind of like how he talks. So if you have questions for Ed, please put them in the Q&A box. We have none so far, so I got to keep asking questions. So the other question I have is, you know, many friends of mine who heard about this talk said, I don't want to be the first person to take it. And I said, well, somebody's got to be first. Somebody's got to take it. And also they said, well, who are they going to give it to first? I mean, I've heard healthcare workers, I've heard people who work in nursing homes, the elderly, but how are they going to do that?
Well, there's a societal priority, right? Which, as you said, would be healthcare workers. And then the most vulnerable, which would be seniors. Although, you know, you have to sort of parse that. You know, we think of seniors, I guess, with someone over 65, because that's when people typically started retiring once this country adopted Social Security, and there were shorter lifespans. But, you know, the world has changed a bit. So is a senior still 65? Is a senior 75? You know, where's the cutoff? And what is it based on? And should it be based on any sort of demographic data? Should it be based on the clinical data? It'd be nice to know, as the trial results come in, how effective the vaccines are for different demographic groups, including age groups. That'll help determine maybe one vaccine is more effective for one slice of the world than another, for instance. Maybe maybe there isn't sufficient evidence to be confident that the vaccine is effective enough in a particular slice of the world. People over, pick a year, 70, 75. So, you know, in an ideal setting, these questions there'd be time to think about these questions and time to look for answers, or at least sort out the best answers possible. I don't know how much time we're going to have. And all the people who are anti-vaccine and concerned about this vaccine, there are going to be a lot of people who want the vaccine. So we do owe it to ourselves to sort this out. I don't really have a good answer how that's going to play out beyond what I just said. You know, there's also the idea of on a more global basis, you know, who's going to get it, because the wealthy countries have lined up contracts with the vaccine makers, but the poor countries haven't. And okay, great, you get the vaccine, you get maybe it works, so enough people in a wealthy country get immunity, but the poor countries don't have vaccines yet, so there isn't sufficient immunity, or hardly any perhaps, and so the virus keeps spreading. So someone might simplistically say, who cares what happens across the world, particularly in a poor country? But poor countries, just to be Machiavellian, putting aside morals and ethics for a second, which some people do anyway, I suppose, but be Machiavellian. Every country in the world is part of the global economy. They all have their role. They all have their place. So and it's not going to be any one or two small countries that we could pretend and close our eyes and turn away and say, oh, too bad. If that happens, we all take a hit, because the global supply chain can't properly function if there's still an immunity problem in swaths of the world. And because that means that if there's an immunity problem in this country, how are you going to trade with that country? How are you going to do business with that country? You can Zoom, as we are. You may not have to visit, but products still get made and shipped. You know, there is still physical movement among people, not just products. And that gets inhibited and thwarted if there's an immunity issue. So I realize I'm being kind of big picture and soapboxish and all that, but I do see this as a problem. It's not going to just go away because, oh, the United States and Western Europe have vaccines, and Russia has whatever they do, and China has whatever they do, and everybody else, well, it's too bad. The virus is everybody's problem. You know, it's not going to just magically go away or be minimized because, you know, we think our situation is better.
Okay, so I do have some questions, and please feel free to add more. What vaccines being developed internationally will not be made available in the United States as a result of our frosty relationship with the World Health Organization?
Well, it's a good question, but the reality is that the United States, apart from Trump's decision not to fund the World Health Organization, the United States is not participating in a World Health Organization called COVAX, which the WHO is relying on two entities. I have to use acronyms, I'm sorry. There's Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and CEPI, and I can never remember the name. I just call it CEPI, C-E-P-I. Their charter here with COVAX is to try to line up enough participation from countries so that vaccine makers would feel, okay, there's an opportunity to make back the investment, because we'll have customers, we'll have countries around the world, and the idea is to entice vaccine makers to offer their supplies. The United States isn't participating, which is a shame, personally. That's my opinion. But as a result, you know, the Trump administration doesn't care, because like some other countries, it's struck deals with several vaccine makers. So it's lining up supplies. So the World Health Organization COVAX program doesn't fit into the way the administration looks at the needs of the United States population. So it's, and then separately, as I mentioned, you have vaccines being developed in Russia and China. Perhaps they'll be more effective than what turns up, you know, the companies that we're watching closely. That would be, you know, an interesting development. And then the administration, you know, may think twice about lack of cooperation with the World Health Organization or other countries. This is an opportunity to show leadership, but it's not that kind of broad-based leadership trying to work in a global health crisis is unfortunately not happening here.
So someone asked, and I think I can answer this, are any of the vaccines being tested in pregnant women or in children? They are, as far as I know.
I don't recall that.
No, they said you had to be over 18.
Yeah, I don't recall that now. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but I just don't recall that.
And also, are they testing it in other groups besides Caucasians?
Yeah, there's been an effort, and I couldn't give you specifics. Like I can't remember because every day is like looking at a fire hose of information. But different companies are saying they're making an effort to ensure that they have certain minorities represented in their trials. You know, it's not necessarily just a reflection of the social unrest in the United States recently. This has been a bugaboo for the industry for a while, ensuring that they have enough minorities in their trials for any number of different products, because at times it's just been insufficient. And it's just coincidental that there was all the social and racial unrest now that makes that question even more pertinent.
Okay, so someone said, okay, CEPI stands for Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation.
Thank you. It's so much easier to use acronyms. I'm guilty of that, like a lot of people.
Someone said, are many or most of the trials designed to target places where the current incidence of new COVID cases is high? What can you tell us about the study sites? How the study sites were selected?
That's a really good question. I have to confess, I don't have a really good answer because I don't have all the study sites in front of me. I'd have to go looking at clinicaltrials.gov. But, you know, there's, I forget who's doing a study, running a trial in Brazil. They've certainly had a high rate. You know, there's concern. I understand that what's behind, in part, I'm going to guess what's behind the question is that, well, if they don't have enough cases, how can you conduct the trial at least on time if you don't have, you know, if you don't have enough participants? You know, that's a challenge because, you know, the companies that are like Moderna and Pfizer and all the other names we know, they're trying to get enrollment done as fast as they can. But there's multiple study sites generally. But I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer. That's a good question, and it's just I don't have the granular level of detail at my fingertips.
Okay, do you know exactly how these trials, how do these trials expose vaccinated participants to the virus? Okay, I'll read it again. We know exactly how these trials expose vaccinated participants to the virus. I guess we don't.
I'm not sure exactly what they're asking, but they're, you know, they're being injected.
Right, yeah, that's what yeah. Do these trials offer incentives to participants? If yes or no, how does that cover the demographics of participants?
I mean, are they being paid to enroll? Good
No.
question. I don't know. I mean, that's typically, this is also a scenario. This doesn't really answer the question, but this is also a scenario where there are people out there who are altruistic and feel that they're, one, maybe they'll benefit, but also they're thinking they'll benefit society. I mean, you do hear about that sometimes in clinical trials. Not everybody enrolls in clinical trials for a living.
No, I've heard, they've always referred to the people as volunteers. So,
well, there was a professor, I forget his name, and I forget which university, but I want to say 10 years ago, he did a book. He spent a lot of time in Philadelphia at clinical trial sites. And he wrote about people who made at least part of their living enrolling in trial after trial after trial because they're getting paid. So that's been in the back of my mind when the question came up.
Yeah, I mean, people donate blood for that reason too.
Yeah.
So what are you writing about now?
Well, I don't actually spend all my time on COVID. and this kind of goes off topic a bit, but at Stat News, we have a subscriber newsletter, and people pay for that. But all our COVID coverage is free. It's not behind the paywall. So I spend a chunk of my time looking for ideas, stories, just news of the day that has nothing to do with COVID, because we still have a newsletter to get out to the paying subscribers. So what am I working on? I can't say everything because some of it's competitive, but I'm looking at other stories that have nothing to do with COVID in a couple of cases. What else am I working on that I can talk about? I probably shouldn't say, because who knows who's listening to me. Sorry.
I know your managing editor signed up, so kidding. So I have a question. So with all the vaccine, so first we were talking about Trump and everyone else was talking about drugs that could treat COVID-19. I don't hear anything about them anymore. All I hear about is the vaccine. I don't hear about hydrochloroquine anymore. I don't hear about remdesivir. All I hear about is the vaccine. So what's the status of drugs being developed to treat people who have it?
Well, that partly is because, it's because vaccines are so politicized, because Trump has suggested that more than once that we might get one in time for his election. As far as medicines go, remdesivir is actually still a pretty interesting story, because it's the only medicine right now that in the United States, for instance, that has any sanctioned use for COVID-19. It's been authorized for emergency use, and it just isn't enough of it. And I'll answer your question about others in a second, but the remdesivir story is interesting because Gilead makes remdesivir, and it's had a history of battling with HIV activists over access to and pricing of its HIV medicines. And these battles have taken place not just in the United States, but countries around the world. And to try and mitigate criticism, Gilead struck licensing deals with Indian generic makers to allow those companies to sell generic versions of their HIV meds in dozens of other countries. Well, they have the same deal with remdesivir. The interesting thing is, as a result, Gilead is the only company in the United States selling remdesivir, but we don't have enough of it. And meanwhile, it's decided it can license generic companies in poor parts of the world. And it's good that they've done that, and people in poor parts of the world can get remdesivir. But it also raises the question, well, if Gilead can do that, do licensing elsewhere, why can't it do it here so we don't have a shortage problem? It's bad enough that the hospital distribution was bungled, but hospitals can't get enough even when it's distributed correctly. So that's one story that's kind of ongoing. And but in terms of medicines for COVID-19, the effort really has been on repurposing medicines as opposed to discovering something new. It's a long process, and you've got to figure out, what are you targeting? Which part of the virus, which part of the body attacked by the virus should you target with your medicine? What's the mechanism of action? I mean, it's more complicated. Some companies have started trials repurposing their drugs, but so far we haven't had stellar results. There's nothing that's turned up that says, oh, okay, this is, except for this old steroid, dexamethasone, which does seem to have some utility in hospitalized patients. But we're waiting for more results, and as I said, it's going to take time to find new medicines, and repurposing medicines is a challenging prospect.
So I have a question. Do you have any information about how COVID-19 will affect 2021 health insurance premiums?
Well, I hate to sound cynical, but I would imagine premiums will go up. You know, if some actuary wants to tell me I'm dead wrong, that'd be good news. But you've got health insurers that are encountering, on one hand, you know, there's a little yin and yang here. On one hand, costs are going up for people who take ill and have serious infections and lingering problems, the long haulers, as they're called, because it's entirely unpredictable, unfortunately, how the virus plays out in some people and what it affects, and does it linger, does it come back, does it touch one part of the body, then another, and then another. So there are a lot of different ways that health expenses are rising. Same time, at least for several months this year, a lot of people didn't go to the doctor. They postponed surgeries, procedures, tests, what have you. For the hospitals and doctors, that was less revenue. For the insurance companies, that was less expense. So, but I'm not privy to their books, but I would guess that the fact that there is some resumption of activity and more people are starting to see their doctor, their dentist, what have you. Not everyone will go as often, but more than we saw in March and April, perhaps. And I'm waiting to see figures. That'd be interesting. But if there's some resumption of health appointments and procedures, the only thing that would counteract that is fewer cases of COVID, and the cases keep climbing. So that the simple math, and I'm happy to be guilty of being simple, but the simple math is that I think that the costs will rise and the health insurers will use that as a reason to raise their premiums. Really long-winded answer, I'm sorry, but times.
My intern has said this is the best time to go to doctors. Well, I'm in New York, and they said because the rates are low. I mean, I had to go to my internist, and there's no waiting room. You wait downstairs and you call, and you come up now, and someone's there at the door, and they bring you right into the doctor's office.
Yeah.
There's no waiting room, so I think that's great.
Well, I'm in suburban Jersey, and I went to the dentist recently, and there's no one in the waiting room. I think there was one other person, another patient, but it was me and whoever else worked there. So yes, in terms.
My dentist looked like he was in the movie Outbreak. He's wearing. Okay, so this is a question about you. Could you comment on the results of merging the independent Pharmalot website with Stat News? What were the advantages and disadvantages? What does your history say about the use of the web for independent journalism? So why don't you explain what Pharmalot is and was?
Okay, I'll try to be really brief. I mentioned that I started covering the pharmaceutical industry 25 years ago. Last month, it was August of '95. I joined the Star Ledger of New Jersey. And after about a decade doing the same thing, a couple of things happened. One, I started to get a little bored. Two, the internet was taking over, and the owners of the Ledger, the Newhouse family, which owns Vanity Fair, the New Yorker, a lot of flashy magazines, were looking for internet ideas. They own Reddit, by the way, to give you an example. And they were leaning on the editor of the Ledger, who's running some regional paper, for global internet ideas, website ideas. I was on good terms with the editor. We were both Rolling Stones fans. So I said to him one day in the bathroom, I got an idea for you, the pharmaceutical industry. He says, write it up. So a year later, after marinating and proposing and getting one of the new houses, to sign off on it at a pitch meeting, we launched a blog called Pharmalot. It was January of '07. And it was designed to be eventually sort of an independent entity if it could sustain itself. We didn't get a chance to really try because the financial crisis hit in '08. And I left with a buyout after that. And I ended up with the rights to Pharmalot. And to make a long story short, I sold it to a private equity firm that had another media company. And I was with that media company for a brief period of time, but then we were sold to another media company that had us for 3.5 years, but they didn't really build our business. And then they actually shut down our division. At that point, I took Pharmalot to the Wall Street Journal, which at the time, this was early 2014, had dozens of blogs. I was the only blog from the outside, though everything was generated internally. And so I sort of coexisted. Yeah, what I wrote was labeled Pharmalot, and it had a particular page, but I also wrote other stories that landed elsewhere on the website or in the print paper. And then when I joined Stat, the Globe launched it just about 5 years ago, this fall. Essentially, it's integrated into the Stat platform. It has its own little, vanity URL. So if you type in Stat News Pharmalot, you'll get all the stuff I've written. But what was the advantage? There's various personal reasons. Because back in 08, when I had the ownership rights, I did try running it myself, but I wasn't going to mortgage my house in the middle of a financial crisis to try and figure out how to grow it. And I was doing all the marketing and advertising myself. And I had my Shark Tank moments and my elevator pitches to VC firms. I did sell to a private equity firm, and it was a good arrangement for a while, but things change. And the advantage here, Stat is a great startup. Stat's been, for 5 years, I've been there since last month was 5 years. It's been a really, really fascinating and invigorating experience. So in a way, I'm living vicariously because I don't own Stat News, but I'm still part of that whole startup mentality. And I like that.
Okay, so in your career, how much have you seen the FDA succumb to political pressure? I mean, I know I covered the HIV trials, and there was always politics.
Sure. The agency does not operate in a vacuum or a bubble. I can't remember how many years ago, several years ago, there was an abortion pill that FDA was going to authorize, approve for certain use, and the HHS director, Kathy Sebelius, overruled Margaret Hemberg. And, that was whole politics, unfortunately. I'm sorry, I can't remember too many details about that now. I did cover it on Pharmalot quite a bit, but it was clear. I mean, if the pill is safe and effective for a certain use, why is the HHS director suddenly getting involved here? That was blatant. That was unfortunate. I don't think that was the appropriate approach to take, because it undermines confidence. I don't care if it's a Democrat or Republican in the White House. If the HHS is going to start trying to push around the FDA at the instruction of White House staff, we've got a problem collectively, because who knows what the next episode is like.
Well, I was at an FDA hearing for the first fast track of AIDS drug, and the committee said it's provisional approval. And David Kessler, who was the commissioner then, stepped in and said, no, give it full approval, because insurance, we need to have it covered by insurance. So I don't know if that's politics, but in a way, it's a bending of the rule in a way, right? To help people. So someone said, I think you're, okay, so RU-486 was the drug you were talking about.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you, David.
RU-486 was the abortion drug, correct?
Yeah.
It's more yet? Okay, so.
I'm one of these people who, I've written so many things, I can't remember them all, unfortunately.
Can you say anything about the relative manufacturing and distribution costs of the different types of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines?
That's a good question. The short answer is I don't have data, and that's something that I think I and others will be looking for, because it speaks to the question of pricing and access. Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, for instance, said they'll make their vaccines available without profit, but we don't really know what the books look like. Meanwhile, U.S. taxpayers are funding the contracts awarded by BARDA to develop and manufacture a vaccine, as the case may be. So there's good reason to know those prices, because at some point, these companies will want to make a profit, And the United States taxpayer essentially was an early investor in the products by way of those HHS barter contracts. So what return, if any, might we get besides access? Will we get vaccinated for free after we're all immune? I'm being simplistic and idealistic. But there's still a need for those vaccines because maybe immunity only lasts for a while. And like the flu, we have to get a shot each year. Who's profiting down the road? So I don't have the answer to the question, but that's why I think we're going to want that data in any event. I'm trying to be helpful in my own way.
I thought they announced the vaccines would be free. That's not true.
I can't remember if every single vaccine will be, and I'm sorry, I should know that detail, but I just can't remember everything. But even if they are, but for how long? I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate deliberately. Are they free for the first year, for the first round of vaccination? For how long? And again, if we need to be vaccinated periodically, will they be free indefinitely? I mean, if so, that's great. Then we're getting a return on our investment. But we don't know those details. You know, it kind of speaks to the transparency issue about the contracts. We don't really know the terms of the contracts either. So that's one reason I'm asking these hypothetical questions.
What could the drug companies do to get people to be better, to be more open? And what could they do to get people to actually trust them and take a vaccine?
Well, we're conflating two different ideas here because trust eroded largely over the last several years due to price for a lot of people, maybe not everyone. And then you have people who are suspicious of vaccines for whatever reasons. And so there are two very different motivations here for the lack of trust. So I don't think there's an easy answer. Even if there was just one of the two reasons, there's no easy answer because the pricing system is so complicated and opaque. And the vaccine issue is extremely emotional. Trust is hard to gain, easy to lose. And anyone who's been in a relationship knows that, right? So I think it's not going to be easy for the pharmaceutical industry to build trust. It's great that those letters, the pledge we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, were issued by the companies. Forgetting or putting aside any selfish interests, to an extent, it certainly does speak to the greater good. And I think that if there's anything the pharmaceutical industry can do, it's to keep the greater good in mind and balance that every time they make a decision about getting on the phone with JP Morgan clients or the price of the vaccine or the access to some countries but not others. I think if it sounds very, very simplistic and idealistic, I understand that. But because companies have not done that often enough, we have people who don't trust vaccines. We have people who are pissed off over price. I didn't make this up. I just write about it.
I want to thank you. I just want to do a little plug. Next week, I'm interviewing Cheryl Pellerin, who wrote a book called Healing with Cannabis. It'll be next Wednesday night. And it's actually a very good book and pretty complex for me to read. I also want to thank my co-chair, Joe Bonner, who is producing this show and setting up the Zoom talks and making it look easier for you and me to talk. So thanks again, and we appreciate it, and I look forward to reading your columns and stats.
Thanks for having me, Dave. Thanks, Joe. And thanks, everybody. I hope it was useful.
Definitely was. Okay, thanks so much. Okay, take care.
Good night.